Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through your AQA AX Sociology paper 2, the paper that we've written for 2024. So the important thing that I really want you to get from this paper is not only the knowledge to help you identify any gaps, but can you answer the exam questions in a way that the examiner wants to see? So we're talking about bounce surveyor 1, bounce surveyor 2, bounce surveyor 3, structuring things in paragraphs. What can you do to make the examiner's life easier and give you more marks?
Welcome to the AS Level Sociology AQA Paper 2, Research Methods and Topics in Sociology, Predicted Paper 2024. Just a reminder, with that Topics in Sociology section of the paper, this one will focus on families and households only. So a reminder for you, you have 1 hour and 30 minutes allowed to complete all questions on this paper in the exam. That means that you are roughly guided to spend 15 minutes every time you are completing 10 marks worth of answer. So for example, on a 20-mark question, you should be allocating 30 minutes. On your shorter tariff questions, you should be only applying around about 5 minutes. You do have to answer all questions of both Section A and Section B. Section A refers to research methods and Section B refers to families and households. This walkthrough will take you through all of the predicted paper questions for 2024. We will have a look at the associated mark schemes, focusing on the skills and the content that the examiners are looking for in the exam, and then also having a look at top band model answers for all 7 questions. So let's get going. Section A, research methods. Question 1. Outline 2 problems associated with using unstructured interviews in sociological research. 4 marks. So this very first question you get regarding research methods is very likely going to ask you to either provide an advantage or a disadvantage of using a specific research method in sociological research. We are only going to spend around about 5 to 6 minutes on this question in the exam, and we really are just going to provide a bullet point response. So a bullet point of around about 2 to 3 sentences separated by another bullet point is all we are being required to do. And I would just advise to outline what the problem, the disadvantage or the advantage is, and then support that with a sentence of description. You need to use key concepts in this answer though. So we are going to be using those key concepts associated with research methods, potentially validity, reliability, generalizations, positivism, interpretivism. And do make sure you look out for those words in the question, like in this one, unstructured, because obviously your answer would be very different if we were talking about a structured interview. This question refers to the problems associated with unstructured interviews. So if it is a disadvantage question or a problems question such as this one, you will be thinking about the opposing research method ideology with regard to the method mentioned. So here we have unstructured interviews, which is an interpretivist way of researching society. So to find problems associated with this method, we are probably going to put our positivist heads on and think about all of the ways that they would criticise using qualitative methods in this way. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. So you can see on the mark scheme then, you get 2 marks for each of the 2 appropriate problems outlined, or 1 for each appropriate problem partially outlined. So there is a maximum of 2 marks per problem that you identify. So there is absolutely no point writing paragraphs about each of your problems. You must keep your answer succinct and must write in a bullet point format. Please do make sure you leave a space between each of your bullet points too, just to highlight to the examiner that you are providing 2 appropriate problems. Also, if you are only able to just outline what the problem is using a key term, something like lack of reliability, as you can see on the 3rd bullet point down, you will only achieve 1 mark out of 2. You must support that concept with a short sentence. Here we've got each interview will be individual to that respondent, meaning it cannot be easily replicated, and that is how you will achieve your 2nd mark. I would always recommend on a research methods question to focus on PhET, practical, ethical and theoretical ideas. So practical problems will be associated with things like the research being time consuming or costly. Ethical problems you can identify might relate to the research causing harm to either the respondents or the researcher. And theoretical are those lovely debates between interpretivism and positivism, where we can bring in key concepts like validity or reliability. So let's have a look at a top band answer. Outline 2 problems associated with using unstructured interviews in sociological research. 4 marks. One problem associated with using unstructured interviews in sociological research is analysing the data produced. As respondents are encouraged to talk freely, it can make comparing the data to spot trends very difficult, as there is no consistency in the responses gained. Another problem is the associated high cost. Unstructured interviews rely on a skilled and highly trained researcher who can interview respondents and probe with minimal pre-planning. Finding and employing such researchers can be very costly. So in our first bullet point there, we have achieved 1 out of 2 by identifying a theoretical issue and also a practical issue in terms of analysing the data that we can achieve through unstructured interviews. Unstructured interviews, as you will be aware, are an interpretivist method whereby probing by the researcher and allowing the respondent to talk as freely and in as much detail as possible is actively encouraged. But as mentioned in our supporting statement there that gets us the 2 out of 2, this means that no one interview is the same. And when the researcher sits down to work through the data that they have achieved, what they will find is they have very, very, very different interviews, potentially even with different questions being asked. And you can see there we then leave a line and move on by starting the next point saying another problem, signposting to the examiner that we are providing 2 different problems associated with this research method. And here we are referring specifically to a practical problem. You get your 1 mark out of 2 there with the associated high cost. We then add detail to support that, and one of the high costs associated with unstructured interviews is the fact that if you are going to require a researcher to be able to effectively probe and allow the respondent to go off topic, then you need to ensure that that researcher has a good sociological understanding of your research topic and also understands how to probe effectively. And anytime there is a labour cost associated with sociological research, that research is going to become very expensive very quickly. So you can see we've easily got our 4 out of 4. Evaluate the strengths of using quantitative methods in sociological research. 16 marks. Ideally, we will have left ourselves around about 23 to 25 minutes to complete this answer in the exam. And in that time, you should be producing a sociological essay of between 3 and 4 chunky paragraphs, either identifying the strengths or the weaknesses of a specific sociological method, or in the case of this predicted paper, a type of methods which is quantitative. Students often find structuring their answer on this one really tricky. I would recommend using the PhET approach. That means focusing on practical, ethical, and theoretical advantages and disadvantages, and really signposting to the examiner every time you do that. I would also recommend that you produce PhET paragraphs. That means point, evidence, explain, link, and that really vital evaluation at the end of every paragraph. So that means whether you're providing a strength or a weakness, at the end of your paragraph, you provide an opposing view that actually addresses the specific point that you have made. Quite often in this essay, those criticisms will be forming a debate between interpretivism and positivism, which is also a really fantastic way to find yourselves in the top band mark scheme. And for this specific question asking you about quantitative methods in general, do make sure that throughout your essay you mention a variety of quantitative methods. Don't just rely on one. So for example, you would want to be referring to questionnaires, social surveys, official statistics, and even potentially experiments. If you also have real life examples of those types of quantitative methods, so for experiments, that might be something like the Stanford prison experiment, then that is also a really useful thing to apply throughout your answer. And then we really just want a short conclusion at the end where you give an overall analysis of what the real strengths of using quantitative methods are in sociological research. Finally, before we look at the mark scheme, I would also always encourage you to structure your answer focusing on the key term in the question, which here is strengths. So start with strengths and use weaknesses in your evaluation. just makes the essay read so much more clearly for the examiner. So let's have a look at the mark scheme. So if we take a look at the 13 to 16 marks level descriptors, a good range of highly relevant and conceptually accurate strengths. With regards to a good range, if you follow the PhET method of practical, ethical and theoretical, that should mean that you hit a really good range within your answer. And conceptually accurate, when it comes to research methods, that means applying those really important key terms such as positivism, interpretivism, validity, reliability, generalizations, and ensuring you support those with definitions and analysis where appropriate. It also says the answer is focused well on the specific question. So for example, this question is asking you about the strengths of quantitative methods. You don't go off on a tangent about the strength of qualitative methods, for example. Good attempts at evaluation or analysis, so that may include some debate that you can create between, in the case of this question, quantitative and qualitative methods, or positivism versus interpretivism. You've got an example sentence there. Positivists would argue that a theoretical advantage of using a quantitative method is that the data obtained is considered highly reliable. This means that should the research be conducted again, it would reproduce similar results. This is highly important to positivists who seek to embed the same principles of other scientific study to sociological research. So within that sentence straight away, you identify the theoretical idea behind quantitative methods, i.e. positivists. You use a key term, highly reliable. You then show analysis through the this means that. And then at the end, you show the overall reason why positivists favour quantitative methods by looking at their overall principles when it comes to research, which is all about producing sociological studies in the same way that scientists produce scientific studies. And if we have a look at the 10 to 12 marks level descriptors, one of the big differences between the two is that you provide an answer that lacks either breadth or depth. So that means you might be able to provide a range of ideas, but those range of ideas are not supported by the kind of explanation we've seen in the previous example sentence. Or you are able to provide good explanation within your answer, but you are only able to do this for a couple of ideas. Your analysis is likely to be less relevant, so that means you might not focus specifically on the point that you have made at the start of your paragraph. Evaluate the strengths of using quantitative methods in sociological research, 16 marks. Quantitative research methods, such as questionnaires, are favoured by positivist sociologists. One strength associated with this type of research are the practicalities. Quantitative research is often quite quick and cheap to conduct, which is beneficial to sociologists who often have limited research budgets granted from funding bodies. For example, if a sociologist carried out a quantitative method, such as analysis of official statistics, this data has already been created and is often available for free on government websites, and therefore can be accessed through a simple internet search. However, official statistics do not necessarily represent a valid picture of society, as interpretivist sociologists argue that they are socially constructed, which is a limitation of using quantitative methods such as this, and also demonstrates the importance of theoretical perspectives when carrying out sociological research. So you can see in that first paragraph, straight away we identify the type of sociologist identified with quantitative methods. And here we are discussing positivist sociologists. Just as a reminder, these are our more scientific sociologists who really want to apply the principles of scientific study to the world of sociology. So they are going to absolutely love any type of research method that is focused on gaining statistical data that we can analyse. We then signpost to the examiner that we are referring to a practical strength of quantitative methods, so within our PhET structure, and here we are referring to the fact that quantitative methods, such as official statistics, tend to be very quick and very cheap to conduct. So we mention official statistics as our specific example of quantitative methods, which links very nicely to practicalities because there are many organisations, such as schools, such as hospitals, that have to produce official statistics all the time and that are really useful for sociologists to use. What we then need to do, though, is provide some evaluation, and here we do that through creating debate with an interpretivist perspective who argue that actually official statistics are not useful because they never provide a valid picture. Remember, this idea of validity is all about, do you actually measure what you set out to? Do you actually gain the truth about what you are trying to study? And here an interpretivist sociologist would argue that any official statistic, while it might masquerade as being an objective truth, is actually just socially constructed. That means it has been created by society itself. There have been third parties involved in the creation of that statistic. Let's take the example of police stop and search statistics. It has been created by a police officer who has decided whether and who to stop and search, and therefore they are not an objective measure of crime in the UK. Let's move on now to the next part of our PhET structure and think about ethics. Another strength associated with quantitative methods is there may be fewer ethical concerns to consider than with other qualitative approaches. This refers to both the researcher and respondents leaving the research unharmed. Quantitative methods such as self-completion social surveys are easily anonymised and therefore all data remains private. Furthermore, they do not rely on lots of researcher and respondent interaction, and due to this detachment it is easier for the respondent to leave the research at any point if they feel uncomfortable. Although this may make researching sensitive sociological topics more difficult, as when completing qualitative research, such as unstructured interviews, the researcher can build trust through a rapport with the respondent and sense if a research project is detrimental to someone's mental or physical health. So within this paragraph, we consider the ethical strengths of using quantitative methods in sociological research. Remember, ethics is all about making sure that you can leave that research process as the researcher and neither you or the respondent has been harmed in any way. It also refers, though, to the way you store that data afterwards to ensure that it is confidential and ensures that no one can be easily identified through your analysis. So here we use a different quantitative example from the first paragraph. We are using social surveys this time and basically arguing that because for most social surveys the respondent is able to complete the research on their own or is just asked a series of questions by a researcher, it is not done in any sort of pressurised environment and it is very easily anonymised because the respondent just doesn't write their name on the top of the questionnaire or the survey. We're also arguing that there is this detachment. So here we mean that the respondent and the researcher don't really need to form any sort of close relationship for this research to take place, which might mean the respondent feels less pressure to complete it and can walk away from the questionnaire at any point if they feel they no longer want to take part. However, we then use that point as our evaluation, because here we are saying that one of the limitations of quantitative methods is the fact that the researcher doesn't build up a close rapport or relationship with their respondent, and therefore they are unlikely to be able to signpost to the respondent that the research topic may be a little bit sensitive, or they are unable to pick up on the respondent becoming uncomfortable and maybe stopping the research themselves from taking place. And that's just also a good example of how you can avoid juxtaposition evaluation in a paragraph, because you make sure the evaluation is tailored completely to the point that you have made. A final strength associated with this methodology in sociology is that they are considered to be more reliable than qualitative methods. This means that the research can be easily repeated with similar results gained, aiding making comparisons over time. Furthermore, many quantitative methods, such as postal questionnaires, can be sent to a very large sample of respondents. The data obtained from these closed-ended questionnaires can then be analysed and displayed in a statistical form, which is favoured by positivists who take a more scientific approach to sociological research. Conversely, interpretivists argue that qualitative methods gain more valid data as they focus on meaning and detailed explanation, often allowing the respondent to act in their normal way through participant observation. So here we come to the last part of our PhET structure and have a look at some theoretical advantages or strengths of using quantitative methods. And the best strength associated with quantitative methods is this idea about reliability. And from an examiner's perspective, reliability and validity are two key terms associated with research methods that students mix up all the time, but you really cannot afford to if you want to get into those top bands. So just to remind you, although reliability and validity are both about sociological research and about how well a method actually measures something, reliability refers to the consistency of the measure, i.e. whether the results are replicable, whereas validity refers to the accuracy of the measure, i.e. do the results really represent what we set out to measure? And here is that big debate between interpretivists and positivists. I think for this 16 marker in the exam, you probably want to focus on a couple of theoretical strengths, just because it is such an important consideration when a sociologist is completing a research method. And here we support that with ideas about the number of respondents that you are able to target. So with quantitative methods, most of the time you are able to access a very large sample quite quickly and quite cheaply. The example we give here is through something like a postal questionnaire. I could have also mentioned an emailed questionnaire. And then within the evaluation, we just go back to that key argument between positivists and interpretivists regarding quantitative and qualitative methods, and whether it is reliability that we are looking to achieve within our sociological research or whether it is validity. That little debate and argument is going to appear in most of these 16-mark questions. To conclude, quantitative methods may have many strengths, such as the practicalities they offer positivist sociologists, but ultimately, as argued by interpretivists, they may lack validity, which is why a mixed methods approach may be favourable in many instances. I would really argue and suggest that most of these 16 markers, where you are being asked to critically evaluate either a style of sociological research or a specific method, quite often in your conclusion, you are going to reach a decision that the mixed methods approach, i.e. applying some positivist quantitative methods, but also supporting that with interpretivist qualitative methods, is always going to give us the best understanding of society. Section B. Topic B2, families and households. Define the term cohabitation, 2 marks. So we really are not going to spend very long at all on these first couple of questions that appear on the families and households section of the paper, a couple of minutes maximum. And with regards to how much you need to write, that really also is just a couple of sentences. So you need to make sure you provide a sociological definition of whatever key term you have been given. And quite often it's good practice to ensure you get 2 out of 2 to support that definition with either the name of a sociologist associated with it, or alternatively to provide an example to support that concept. And to prepare for these types of questions in the exam, I really would advise going through every topic within families and households, from demography to childhood to changing family patterns, and ensuring that you have a list of as many key concepts associated within that topic as possible, with a short, succinct definition and also an example or sociologist to support it. So if we now consider the term cohabitation, this is obviously one of those family types that we have seen increasing over the last 20 to 30 years within the UK, and it refers to a couple that live together long term as opposed to getting married. And whilst many of the theoretical perspectives that we study are highly critical of this cohabitation in society, particularly the new right, who see it as one of the main issues creating family instability, Robert Chester argues that actually cohabitation is very infrequently an alternative to marriage. Actually, cohabitation in modern society, according to Chester, is just a delay tactic. It is a trial marriage whereby couples are choosing to live together in long-term relationships, sometimes also having children, before they then become a traditional nuclear family and do get married. So let's have a look at a perfect 2 out of 2 answer. Define the term cohabitation, 2 marks. Cohabitation refers to a household structure whereby the members are in a long-term relationship but are not legally married. These family structures are increasing in modern society due to secularisation. So you can see there are 2 sentences, and in each of those 2 sentences we would be able to achieve 1 mark in the exam. The first sentence is that sociological definition where we actually define what cohabitation refers to, and in the second sentence we just add a bit of sociological detail about the prevalence and trends of these type of families in modern society. And we are arguing that this is a consequence of secularisation, i.e. the decline in the significance of religious organisations such as the Christian Church in the UK that tended to promote the idea of heterosexual, monogamous and married couples. We could of course also have referred to the new right theory here and discussed the fact that they are very opposed to cohabitation as they see it as creating unstable family structures, particularly for young children. Or we could have also included some sociology from Chester, who argues that cohabitation is not a revolutionary new style of having a relationship in society. It is simply a trial marriage, or it is people delaying getting married by living together first. Using one example, briefly explain how family structures could be considered more equal today. 2 marks. So once again, we are only going to be spending a few minutes, 3 to 4 minutes maximum on this type of question, and we are just going to be providing 2 sentences. In order to achieve 2 out of 2, we need to ensure we show the examiner that we provide an example and then a sentence of very brief explanation to support that example. Examples may include key concepts, they may include specific sociologists, or they may include specific types of families. And the term in this question that often catches students out is family structures. So just to be really clear, family structures relate to any types of families or the roles that members within families perform. So if we were going to consider a nuclear family in the past, we would argue that the structures within that family traditionally tended to be a male breadwinner role and a female caregiver role. Whereas in this question, the examiners are looking for the exact opposite of that, some evidence to support the idea that those kind of family structures are now outdated and that in modern society, the structures or the makeup of families tends to be more equal between all of its members. So we might be talking about male and female relationships within the family. We might be talking about male and male or female and female structures within the family. Or we could even be talking about parent and child relationships within the family to consider them more equal today. So let's now have a look at a 2 out of 2 answer and think about some different examples we could have also included. Using one example, briefly explain how family structures could be considered more equal today. 2 marks. One example of how family structures could be considered more equal in today's society is the development of a symmetrical family. Young and Wilmer argue that many couples now both share responsibilities of domestic work and childcare due to women's increased employment. So within that first sentence, we refer specifically to a key concept or idea. Here is the symmetrical family, and then we support that with Young and Wilmot's study. Just to remind you of Young and Wilmot's study, because it is so fundamentally important for so many topics within families and households. They really did develop many of their ideas from social surveys. They take what is known as a march of progress view, and they concluded that by the 1970s, there tended to be relationships in modern families where men and women were acting in more symmetrical ways. That means they are now spending their leisure time together. They are both working. They are both taking an active interest in looking after the children. And their study also just works alongside other structural changes in society, like the rise of feminism and changes in the law such as the Equal Pay Act, all changing people's attitudes towards women's right to go out to work and earn the same living as men. And that actually is an alternative example that we could have included in this question, and we could have discussed dual earning families. That is families where both the male and the female are earning money financially to contribute towards the finances of the family overall. Equally, we could have referred to a pooling system whereby partners now are more likely to have joint responsibility and access to any money coming into the family or any expenditures going out of the family. Or we could have even gone for the negotiated family, a much more contemporary example whereby families no longer conform to traditional family norms but instead negotiate their expectations, which can obviously lead to much more equal family structures. Outline 3 ways government policy may impact family structures. 6 marks. So you should be looking to spend around about 8 to 10 minutes on this question, and you are going to provide 3 bullet points as your answer. And in each of those bullet points for this specific question, it would be a very good idea to include a specific government policy that you are aware of. So you really do need to make sure that you go into the exam confident of a range of specific government policies, making them as contemporary as possible and understanding the way that they have affected family structures. With regard to that term family structures, students often find that quite tricky, and it basically refers to the way a family is made up. So that could include family types such as the nuclear family. It could include same-sex couples. It could include one-parent families. And when it comes to government policies and family structures, we are normally looking for ways a specific government law may have increased the likeliness of a specific type of family, or alternatively, the way a government law may have actually discouraged a certain type of family. We are going to make sure we separate all of our 3 bullet points clearly with a line between each of them, outline the government policy, and then provide 1 or 2 sentences of supporting detail. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. So you can see the mark scheme clearly states 2 marks for each of the 3 appropriate ways clearly outlined, or 1 mark for each appropriate way partially outlined. So that just confirms we do not want to be writing in paragraphs for this answer. We need to keep our answer succinct and short because we will only get a maximum of 2 marks per idea put forward. And you can see there how the 1 mark can be made up and how you can then get your extra mark on top. And within that first bullet point, it's really clear to see we are arguing that the new structure is more family diversity, so different types of families. And we support that with a specific policy such as the Same-Sex Couples Act, which led to more same-sex couples in society. Whenever you get a question that asks you about family structures, you are always going to see some of these same terms on the mark scheme. So by that I mean family diversity, I mean single parent families, I mean nuclear families, cohabitation, remarriages and reconstituted families. So if you think about your family structures, normally then it'll be much easier to think about the type of social policy that may have affected them. Let's have a look at a top-band model answer. Outline 3 ways government policy may impact family structures. 6 marks. Government policy may impact family structures by creating more dual earning households. Laws such as the 1970 Equal Pay Act have encouraged women to take on employment opportunities and become more symmetrical with their partner. Another way is policies that reduce the number of children families typically have, creating beanpole structures. This could be due to laws ensuring that all children stay in education until 18, making it more unaffordable to have large families. Finally, government policy could create patriarchal family structures. Feminists argue that laws such as the Maternity Act tend to assume the female is the main caregiver and therefore reinforce male power within the family. If you look at the structure there with that 6 marker, there are 3 bullet points, i.e. 3 ways clearly identified to the examiner, and there is a space between each of those points. Within that first point, we identify the family structure as changing as being an increase in dual earning households. So that refers to households whereby the male and the female typically are both now providing and performing a financial function within the family. And we support that through the 1970 Equal Pay Act. I would really recommend going into the exam being fairly confident in that act and the Sexual Discrimination Act, because if you ever have an essay or a question where you are discussing feminism and the changing position of women in society, both of those social policies that have made the work working life of women fairer and more equal are really good examples to use. We then look at the number of children families typically have. We know that there is a massive problem about a declining birth rate in the UK, and here we mention the term beanpole structures. So this means families that are getting skinnier and skinnier because they are having fewer and fewer children. And we are making a very contemporary argument here that this could be due to some very recent social policy, meaning that children have to stay on an education until they are 18, which means that for a lot of families, having more children becomes unaffordable. Remember, there's that key statistic that it costs on average £250,000 to raise a child to the age of 21 now in society. And in our final bullet point, we apply some theory whereby feminists argue that social policy or government policy just really serves to create more patriarchal family structures. So that is a hierarchical family structure where the male is at the top and the female is exploited. And here we use examples such as the Maternity Act, which basically determines that women have the right to have up to 52 weeks maternity leave if they are having a baby and classed as an employee, which may sound like a positive government policy, but in relation to feminism and particularly radical feminists, they argue that this just reinforces this status quo or stereotypical view in society that men are the financial earners and females are the caregivers. Outline and explain 2 functions of the family in society. 10 marks. So a quick reminder that this is a 10-mark question, so you need to allocate yourself 15 minutes to complete the answer. And within that time, you need to be writing 2 paragraphs. I would recommend using the PEAL structure to do that: point, evidence, explain, and link. As this is a 10-mark question, there is absolutely no need to write an introduction and there's no need to write a conclusion. There is also no need to include any evaluation in your answer to reach the top band. And so what we are looking for in this question is 2 separate functions the family performs for society. Functions is a term that comes up a lot in the sociology exam. It can sometimes throw students off, but it normally just refers to things that the family does, roles that the family performs in society. And another hint when it comes to the term functions in a sociology question, it normally means that you can be confident in applying theoretical knowledge. So that means that we can look for functionalist ideas, Marxist ideas, feminist ideas, and possibly even the new right or postmodern ideas. I would also be really cautious about when you are completing this answer to make sure that you refer to specific family types. So for example, if you decide to go down the route of either the new right or functionalism, you need to be really clear for the examiner that you are referring only to the nuclear family and not the new types of family structures that we've discussed within changing family patterns or family diversity. It's also absolutely fine in a question like this where you are referring to the functions of the family to not be positive. So obviously some theoretical perspectives will argue that the family still performs very important functions in society. But if you wanted to go down the route of talking about Marxism or feminism, it's absolutely fine to mention the fact that these theoretical perspectives, whilst they do acknowledge the family performs important functions for society, they see these functions as being for the benefit of the powerful, i.e. for Marxists in the interest of the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, and for feminists in the interest of men in a patriarchal society. And the other helpful tips I would advise going into a question like this is to ensure that you have key concepts to support your idea about the functions. So if you are using someone like Parsons, for example, make sure you refer to the key concepts associated with his ideas of the functions of the family, such as men performing the instrumental role and women performing the expressive role. And I think the final trap that students sometimes fall into on these types of functions questions is by just applying loads of narrative description about specific things the family can do for society. It's really important to get into the top band that you avoid this type of descriptive writing and ensure that you are analysing. And the easiest ways to ensure or to show the examiner that we are analysing on a 10-mark question are to use those really useful phrases such as "this means that," or "this leads to," or "this is a significant function because." So with that in mind, let's have a look at the mark scheme. So if we have a look at our 8 to 10 mark criteria there, we need to apply 2 ways that are clearly explained. I would always recommend in the exam leaving a space between your 2 points. And we are going to explain those 2 points using theory, using examples, using key concepts. It says you will have detailed knowledge in both of your points. There are a wide range of ideas that you could apply within a functions question like this 10 marker. So you need to make sure that you carefully select the theories that are different enough that you can apply different detailed knowledge in both points, but that you are comfortable enough describing with a good level of detail and knowledge. Contemporary examples are always really useful in a 10 mark question too. Analysis will be detailed and developed in both points. So in both of your paragraphs, you will be able to show how one idea leads to another idea and leads to another idea. And the big difference between the 4 to 7 marks and the 8 to 10 marks is that you will be able to do all of those things in both of your points, whereas in a 4 to 7 mark answer, typically the knowledge will just be good, or the knowledge will only be very detailed in one of the 2 ideas that you have identified. Typically on this mark scheme, if you are able to identify 2 functions and add some quite limited knowledge that does support the question, you will be able to achieve around about 5 marks. So even if you are struggling in the exam and you don't feel like you can write 2 full paragraphs, maybe you're running out of time, then it is still very worthwhile writing 2 ideas out, adding some description that you can, and picking up those vital 5 marks. And if you just have a look at the example sentence there within the 8 to 10 mark level descriptors, you will be able to see the use of some really complicated sociological language. We start by identifying a theory. Functionalists argue that the nuclear family, so we identify our specific family type, is the beating heart of a complex and interdependent modern society. So here we're referring to the organic analogy and suggesting that that still is relevant within a modern society. We then provide an example using a key concept such as primary socialization. So that refers to those norms, values and culture that is learned within the family environment from the first sort of 0 to 5 years of a child's life, which is then finally linked to the value consensus, which means we maintain harmony in society. Therefore, justifying that the nuclear family still performs a very important function for society. Let's now have a look what a full top-band answer might look like. Functionalists view the nuclear family as an essential structure in maintaining a stable society. One specific function of the family, according to functionalists, is primary socialization. This refers to the idea that between birth and schooling age, children are taught vital norms, values and culture at home with their parents that later helps them to integrate into wider society. Functionalists such as Parsons also argue that this primary socialization is important to establish traditional gender roles within the family structure and wider society. An example of this would be a young girl being taught how to carry out domestic chores at home during primary socialization, which will then help her to fulfill an expressive role within her own family unit when she is older. Therefore, according to Parsons, the nuclear family has a vital function in maintaining a value consensus in society. So, if we have a look at this first paragraph in a bit more detail, I just want to first of all point out to you the very clear Peel structure that really does ensure that this would get into the top band. So, after we've identified our theoretical perspective as being functionalism, we clearly make our point by using the phrase one specific function of the family. We then go on to explain this function through the use of the phrase this refers to, and once we've explained this theory of primary socialization being the function of the family, we support it through the use of an example. We use an example of a specific gender type role learnt within the family. And finally, we use the word therefore to ensure we go back to answering the question, providing that link statement that actually families do perform a vital function for functionalist perspectives. And if we have a look at the key content within that paragraph, the question asks us about functions of the family. Therefore, you can be very confident that on the mark scheme, it will mention the theoretical perspective positive functionalism. So here we are starting with one of the most significant functionalists, Parsons, and his ideas that the family unit as a nuclear family is absolutely vital, not just for individuals to learn the norms, values and culture of the society that they will become a part of once they leave the family, but also for the wider implications of the organic analogy, whereby the family really is, according to Parsons and Durkheim, the heart of society, and all the other structural institutions such as religion, such as education, rely on the nuclear family performing its vital functions. Just a reminder as well of that key term, nuclear family. It's a traditional family structure where you have normally a heterosexual couple living under the same roof with one or more biological or adopted children. And it is, of course, very important that we make clear to the examiner that we are only referring to the functions of the nuclear family and not families in general, because functionalists such as Parsons and Durkheim would be opposed to family diversity and new family types such as single parent families, where they just don't feel this primary socialisation can happen effectively. Let's have a look at the second paragraph. Another function of the nuclear family is, according to Murdoch, to maintain stable satisfaction of the sex drive. In his study of 200 societies, Murdoch concluded that the nuclear family was universal in ensuring that male sexual desire was met within a monogamous relationship. This is a crucial function, according to Murdoch, as without this men may become promiscuous and produce children out of wedlock that they don't feel emotionally attached to, and therefore do not financially provide for, leaving it instead to the state. This then creates single parent family structures, which do not contain male role models, and consequently children are not adequately socialised. Therefore, the family forms a useful function in ensuring children are financially supported by their fathers. And if we have a look at the structure of this paragraph again to ensure we get into our top band, you can see that we have identified in the first sentence the point of our argument, which is that Murdoch says the family unit as a nuclear family maintains stable satisfaction of the sex drive. What we do in this paragraph differently to the top paragraph is change the order of our example and our explanation, and it is absolutely fine to do that in the exam. So here we start with our example that Murdoch argued that the nuclear family was functional and universal in society. Just to ensure we are aware what that term universal means, it means it's found everywhere and functions everywhere. We then go on to explain this critical function through the idea that without monogamous relationships, men would start sleeping around with lots of different women and produce children that they don't feel they need to support, instead leaving that function to the welfare state, which we know new right sociologists and traditional functionalists like Murdoch are very opposed to. They see the male in society as needing to fulfill that breadwinner role, providing financial and economic support for his family members to ensure that the state does not need to. We then create more analysis through that phrase, this then creates, and we talk about the type of family structures that will be created if men are promiscuous, i.e. sleeping around. And finally, we use that same word again, therefore, to ensure we are linking back to the question and fully answering what the function of the family is according to Murdoch, which in this paragraph is all about ensuring children are supported economically and do not need to rely on a welfare state. Just to remind you of the other ideas we could have applied here from Murdoch then. So in his study of families around the world, he concluded that there are more than just sexual functions of the nuclear family. He said that the nuclear family is also absolutely essential for economic purposes, as we've mentioned, to ensure that the family is supported and provided for by the male. He argues that the family also provides educational functions for society, i.e. teaching children the correct norms and values. He argues there is a reproductive function of the family in society, ensuring that we have a next generation. Now, obviously, we don't need evaluation on this 10 marker, but just to think about the kind of evaluation we could apply to both of these paragraphs with regards to Parsons and Murdoch's theory of the functions of the family in society. Both sociologists are only ever referring to the functions of a nuclear family. So they totally ignore the influence and impact of family diversity on modern society, where we now, through changes in the law, through in the changing position of women, have a variety of different family types who many sociologists would argue are still performing some fantastic functions for society. And just to consider other structural theories that you might have wanted to apply within this answer, later, if you'd have discussed Marxism, you would have still been discussing the functions of the nuclear family, but you would have been more likely arguing that the nuclear family performs functions to maintain the status quo of the bourgeoisie, i.e. to keep the rich rich and to keep the poor poor. And that may be done through things like inheritance of property, where males within a nuclear family feel like they have a legitimate heir to pass their wealth on to. If you'd have been talking about feminism, you may have argued again that the nuclear family performs a vital function in maintaining the patriarchy, so in keeping men in their position of power. And there we would have used examples such as the domestic division of labour, where women are expected to take on a housewife role. Even if they're now going out to work, they're still expected to do the domestic chores, leading to them having a harder life within the family. Read item A and answer the question that follows. Item A. Some sociologists argue that childhood is simply a social construct that has changed dramatically over time. This means that childhood has only recently been recognised as a special time in one's life. It could be argued families now cherish their children and centre their lives around their happiness. However, other sociologists disagree with this view and argue that modern childhood is getting worse as it has become blurred with adulthood. Applying material from item A and your own knowledge, evaluate the view that childhood is always improving in society. 20 marks. So, on this last question on the paper, you will be advised to spend 30 minutes. And within that 30 minutes, you need to read item A, interpret what the item is arguing, produce a plan, and then a full sociological essay with around 4 Peely paragraphs and a short conclusion. I would recommend using the Peely structure for each of your 4 paragraphs, which means point, evidence, explain, link and evaluation. And as you will see in a second on the mark scheme, that really just does ensure that you will hit everything the examiner is after. And with regards to the item, this should act as a stimulus for you before you begin writing the essay. So you really do need to go through it, highlight 2 or 3 phrases that you can formulate some argument from, as you know that the content within the item is going to appear on the mark scheme. However, it is also absolutely essential that you do not just rely on material from item A. You must include your own knowledge as stated in the question, because if you do not, then you will find yourself in a lower mark band. So you can see within this item, there are a couple of sentences that should help you to plan your essay. The very first sentence mentions childhood being a social construct. This is an idea often associated with Aries that refers to childhood not being a universal or fixed status, but rather being something that society has created. And the way we might measure that is through childhood changing between different countries, between different cultures, and also between different time periods. So it might be that you want to apply some Aries in your answer, as Aries conducted content analysis regarding childhood as a social construct. If we then have a look at the next sentence, it refers to childhood now being a very special time in one's life. This is associated with the child-centered view of society nowadays, that childhood has become the focal point of all families, and therefore children's needs are met emotionally and financially by their parents. It could be one of the reasons why families are now smaller, and it could certainly be some fantastic evidence to support our essay question here that childhood is improving in society. We then get a very typical final sentence within the item suggesting that there is another viewpoint, that there are other sociologists that argue childhood is not always improving in society as stated in the question, but rather childhood is getting worse. And this really relates to Postman's argument about the disappearance of childhood and the fact that new technologies such as the internet, such as social media, means that children are constantly exposed to adult material that adults really are not supervising. And when it comes to structuring this essay, there really are 2 ways to go about it. You could either provide 2 paragraphs on one side of the argument that childhood is always improving, and 2 paragraphs on the other side of the argument to suggest that childhood is actually getting worse or childhood is becoming blurred. Or you could provide 4 paragraphs to suggest that childhood is always improving, but just add loads of lovely evaluation at the end of every paragraph. Whichever way you do decide to structure it, just ensure that you do avoid only providing juxtaposition evaluation. That means just going from one side of the argument to another. You must apply evaluation to every single one of your paragraphs, and that criticism must relate to the point at the top of your paragraph. With that in mind, let's have a look at the mark scheme. So if we have a look at these 17 to 20 marks level descriptors then, the first bullet point states that knowledge is almost always detailed. So that means throughout the whole of your essay, whenever you apply a point, you are able to support that with sociological explanation, normally in the form of sociologists, theorists, theory, or even examples. Your ideas are going to be conceptual. So within a childhood essay, we are going to see lots of ideas about toxic childhood, about age patriarchy, and about child-centeredness. And finally, your answer should be analytical. So using phrases within the main body of each of your paragraphs, such as this therefore suggests, this leads to, this means that, this is a consequence of, just creating that lovely sociological chain of reasoning. Explanation and evaluation are highly relevant, so you ensure, particularly when it comes to evaluation, as mentioned previously, you avoid the mistake of just applying juxtaposition evaluation, going from one argument to the next, and you apply your criticism directly to the point that you have made. And when it comes to using a number of theoretical perspectives with that specific essay, you will be applying information from the idea that childhood is socially constructed, ideas about childhood always improving from the march of progress perspective, and also ideas that childhood is actually getting blurred or worse from either a postmodern or a conflict perspective. And throughout the whole of your essay, you should be reaching sociological conclusions whereby in that link part of your paragraph, you are able to go back and fully answer the question about whether childhood is improving over time based on the evidence that you have presented. And the real difference between a 17 to 20 mark essay and a 13 to 16 mark essay is the ability that you have to do that throughout the whole of your essay. It's also the ability to apply a good range or a good level of detail. So for example, on a 13 to 16 mark essay, you may apply a number of ideas, maybe 5 or 6, but you don't develop them all in lots of detail and analysis, or you might only be able to apply 2 ideas, but those 2 ideas you do apply, you are able to explain in a very good level of detail and understanding. So let's have a look at a top band answer. Applying material from item A and your own knowledge, evaluate the view that childhood is always improving in society. 20 marks. Many sociologists, as mentioned in item A, view childhood as being socially constructed. This means that childhood did not exist in the same form it does now in the past and is still different depending on which culture you live in. In Western society, sociologists such as Aries argue that children are now the centre of the modern family and that childhood is viewed as a special time in one's life. For example, Aries concluded that in the past childhood did not really exist and that children were merely viewed as mini adults. This means that they dressed the same as adults, took part in similar activities and were given many of the same responsibilities. Whereas in modern society, parents now place a high importance on ensuring that their children are happy and well looked after. However, Aries' research has been criticised due to his methodology. In completing content analysis, Aries focused on paintings which tend to depict only middle-class children, making the sample unrepresentative of all childhood experiences, and therefore makes it difficult for sociologists to make generalisations about the experience of childhood. So you can see on this model answer, we do not include an introduction, and that really is just because timing is so tight on these 20 markers, and you are always going to pick up so many more marks on the main body of your answer. It's actually really tricky for an examiner to be able to pull much out of a short introduction. Here we go into that first argument identified in the item about childhood being socially constructed. Note then the use of the phrase "this means that," which just highlights to the examiner that we are now analysing this key quote and applying some of our own knowledge. And whenever we are discussing childhood as a social construct, I would encourage you to use Aries' study, which, if you remember, was his content analysis regarding childhood as a separate stage of life until the 15th or 16th century, where children were really just seen as mini adults. They wore many of the same clothes as adults, they took part in many of the same activities, and they had a lot of the same responsibilities. And we use this to support the idea in the question that this shows us that childhood is always improving in society, as by taking this march of progress view that childhood is always getting better over time, we clearly no longer treat children this way, and now parents actually ensure that the children are the focal point of the family. And what we then do at the end of this paragraph is avoid the trap of just applying juxtaposition juxtaposition evaluation. An example of juxtaposition evaluation would be just applying a general sentence on the end of this paragraph whereby you say, however, some children are still abused by their parents and therefore childhood is not improving. Whilst that sentence may be correct, and whilst we may want to use that elsewhere in the essay, it does not apply to the point that we have made here. So what we do is apply specific evaluation for Aries study, arguing that actually it is not very useful or valid for a sociologist to use the experiences of children drawn in portraits to understand the overall experiences of childhood in any era. Moving on to the next paragraph. There are other ways we may also argue that children are now cherished in the family as mentioned in item A, and that childhood is always improving over time. March of Progress sociologist Lloyd de Moors argues that childhood has drastically improved. De Moors argues only 100 years ago, childhood used to be a nightmare where children were often unloved and abused by family members. However, this has now changed and children are now protected through the law. This research could be criticised as de Moors focus is mainly on Western society and there are still cultural variations in the treatment of children. For example, in some developing countries like Bolivia, children are still expected to work long hours and carry many of the same responsibilities as adults. Furthermore, Marxists argue that many working class children in the UK still experience poverty and hardship. So within this second point, we are still referring to an idea that childhood has drastically improved over time, here using the work of Lloyd de Moors, who wrote a very famous book called The History of Childhood, The Untold Story of Child Abuse, which basically argues childhood used to be a nightmare of abuse and neglect, and that now, thankfully, children are protected through laws. These laws include things like the Education Act, which means that children are entitled to an education in the UK rather than being sent to work as they were in the past. You could also use the example of child charities here, such as the NSPCC, which also support child protection within the UK now. And what this paragraph also does really well is apply plenty of evaluation to criticise this view of childhood getting better and better over time. So firstly, we consider children in Bolivia. Do just be careful if you are using worldwide examples that the question is supporting that. Some questions will specify in the UK today. This one does not, and therefore we can use Bolivia where children are expected to have duties and responsibilities, sometimes as young as the age of 5 or 6, and maybe working in full-time employment by the age of 10. We then do further support that with an example that is UK-based, whereby there are lots of children in the UK who are still experiencing relative poverty, and therefore may still be open to some of the misery that Lloyd de Moors identified within his book. Another way one may argue that childhood has improved significantly and continues to in modern society is studying the large sums of money parents now spend on children. In the past, children may have been considered as an economic asset to parents, as they could be sent to work. However, due to child protection laws in the UK and compulsory education, children are now considered more of an economic liability and cost their parents on average £250,000 by the time they reach 21. This has led to smaller family sizes and means that children now have access to thousands of pounds of resources, toys, holidays and clothes that support the view families are now more child-centred than ever. However, Palmer argues that this does not mean that childhood is getting better, but simply that children now experience a toxic childhood whereby they are essentially poisoned by consuming too much television, violent video games and junk food. So within this paragraph we are looking at the finances and how children are given access to more material goods than they were in the past as evidence to support the idea that childhood is getting better. You've got a statistic in there that I would really recommend remembering for the exam. £250,000 or £250,000 spent on average by the time every child reaches 21. And you can see next to that statistic that key phrase, this has led to, which ensures the examiner is fully aware that you are analysing this statistic, and the analysis here points towards those smaller family sizes. This also relates to demographic trends. We know we have a declining birth rate in the UK, and on average now the UK is made up of 1.74 children per family. There's another statistic you could use to support that £250,000 sum. And we then move on to applying a fundamentally important study when it comes to modern childhood, which is Palmer. And Palmer actively actively disagrees with the view that childhood has gotten better over time and instead comes up with this fantastic concept about a toxic childhood, that childhood has actually become poisonous to children due to the material goods that they are consuming. And we could further support those ideas about junk food, video games, by statistics such as 1 in 6 children now being recognised as obese by the NHS. Moving on. Finally, one could argue that childhood is always improving due to the protection children receive within the law. As childhood is now viewed as a time when we are more vulnerable, the government continues to produce policies to protect children from harm, which could improve children's lives greatly. Examples include educational reforms, ensuring children have learning opportunities until 18, drinking and smoking restrictions to protect health, and trained professionals such as social workers to protect their interests. However, conflict sociologists argue that this merely represents an age patriarchy, whereby adults now control children's time, space and bodies, and therefore means childhood is getting worse, not better. And this paragraph focuses more on structural changes within the law that have improved childhood, and there are some fantastic contemporary examples in there. One such as the education reform, which has been introduced in the last 10 years, making it compulsory for young people to be in some form of education or training until the age of 18, or the even more recent examples of smoking restrictions, meaning that for young children, smoking will always be an illegal act within their lifetime. And there are obviously two different ways to look at these types of laws. Some sociologists will argue that absolutely this is protecting children and therefore it is improving the lives of children. However, as mentioned in the evaluation, conflict sociologists will argue that this represents what is known as an age patriarchy. So just like when we use that term patriarchy within feminism and it refers to male dominance over females, age patriarchy refers to adult dominance over children. And we normally measure that through the use of children's bodies, space or time. So parents or adults may control where children are allowed to go, may control what children are allowed to wear, may control what children are allowed to do at what times. And as we move into a more postmodern society where there are more and more laws and restrictions on what children can and can't do, conflict sociologists will argue this therefore means childhood is not getting better, childhood is getting worse because children have less freedom. Finally, to conclude, as March of Progress sociologists suggest, children are now fortunate to experience care and protection, and many families do appear to take a child-centred approach. However, we cannot generalise this applies to all children, even within the UK. So that very short conclusion just summarises the main argument that we have found to suggest that actually, for the majority of children in the UK, it is undoubtedly a more positive experience to be a child now than it was 100 years ago. However, we must also consider that we cannot overgeneralise and there will be some pockets of children, perhaps those that are suffering poverty or hardship, that will not be experiencing such a positive time.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.